go. Hold on a minute.
Great.
Hold on a minute. There we go.
Greetings, YoraHome family, and welcome to the inaugural YoraHome Creators Night. My name is Angie, and I am the Customer Service Manager for YoraHome, and this is our talk show of sorts, where we are going to one night a month, be able to introduce you and showcase some of the amazing talent we have in our ambassador program. And hopefully along the way teach you some tips and tricks from some of our ambassadors. Tonight's guest is my amazing husband, Jim. He is the head of the tech support here for the company, and he's going to show us some basic project setup for our first machine, the 3018, and also cover some of the bit settings for not only the starter bits, but the different bits for the essential set. So I'm going to turn it over to Jim, and he's going to teach us, and then I will close out the night and show you what some of the upcoming events are.
All right. Hello, everyone.
Just after that chat, and I will try and have them answer.
All right. In case you didn't catch that, Angie said if you got any questions, put them into the chat or into the comments, and we'll get those answered for you. I've probably talked to a lot of you before. If anyone that's called for tech support has definitely wanted to hear from us or needed assistance from us, so I've managed to talk to a lot of those people. We now have Nick on board as well. But tonight we wanted to talk a little bit about the 3018 because that was our first big machine, and it's probably the one that gives us the most questions and makes people wonder, am I doing this right? What do I need to do to get started? Why is it not moving in the direction I want it to move in? So those are some of the key things that I wanted to talk about tonight. Then we'll get into a little bit about how to set up your project, as Angie mentioned, and we'll look at some of the bits and talk about how to select a bit and how to get the settings for your bits right. So the first thing is your basic 3018. We've got our work platform here. I've got a piece of wood clamped down to it right now. You'll notice that I have some different clamps. Yours are obviously going to be a little bit different. We got our spindle assembly, Z-axis right here, and then I've got a selection of bits as well that we're going to talk about. So the first thing that usually gets people confused is, how do I connect to my machine? Why is it not connecting? Why am I getting stuck with errors? It times out waiting for it to connect. The reason behind that is because originally Easel has been developed for the X-Carve machine, which is a much larger, much more powerful, much more expensive machine. However, it was found that it also works well with these smaller scale machines. We have to go through a few extra steps to get there. So in order to do that, we need to go into Easel. So what I'm going to do is switch over to Easel here. So this is the basic screen that we see when we're in Easel. This is our workspace on the left and our preview on the right. Now, if you're hooking up a brand new machine, there's a good chance that you're going to see, just like I am right now, I've got a problem here because I'm not connected to my machine. You can see here that my carve button is blue. I am not currently connected to a machine. If I try and do my machine setup, I'm going to get stuck because it's going to try and connect and we're not going to get anywhere. So the first thing we need to do is actually initialize that communication with the machine. So what I'm going to do is make sure that I've got my USB cable plugged in, and I'm going to actually click on the carve button. And it's going to tell us, oh my goodness, we cannot find your COM port. We can't find your machine. So what we want to do is enter our COM port manually. Now if you go through Device Manager, and we've got instructions for that in the manual, it's a little bit different depending on the operating system of your computer, so I don't want to get into the exact means of getting there right now. But if we tell it what COM port we're on, and hopefully I'm actually on the right one, I may need to double check my machine. So I'm going to do that real quick. And it seems that I'm actually on COM port 7 right now. So I need to go back to my device, tell it I am on COM port 7. Sometimes it takes it a second, but you'll notice that now my button just turned green. That tells me that I'm now talking to my machine. Easel is able to communicate with the 3018, but we still need to make sure that it's set up properly. So once we've got that and we're happy with this green button, green meaning everything is good to go, we go to our machine options. I've already set this up previously, but I'm going to go through it all again real quick because it just takes us a minute. We want to set up your machine. We're going to make sure that we select other or third-party machine, and Inventables has been nice enough to work with us, and they actually changed their setup a little bit, so now we see a picture of a basic 3018, so that gets us moving in the right direction, makes it easier for our users. We have a GRBL type machine. That's the type of controller that's on our 3018. For the model, we're not seeing the drop down necessarily on here, but we want to select the either other, or you can select the DIY CNC 3018. For the motion controller, we need to select the Arduino type. That is the main chipset on the board. The rail size is kind of irrelevant. We say 500 by 500 because that works best. For the lead screw, we want to select that M8 threaded rod. Even though that states that it was discontinued, that's as it applies to the X-Carve, not to the 3018. The 3018 still uses that size rod. For a spindle, we're going to select other, and for the maximum RPM, we don't really care about that. The 3018 simply turns our spindle off and on, so we don't need the exact RPM for that. We're going to confirm our settings, and then it's going to ask us for our COM port again. In my case, it was a 7. And then it continues. Now here's where we need to make sure that we test our wiring. This is the problem where a lot of people run into. So I'm going to switch views so you can actually see the machine here. When we are testing our wiring, the first one up there is the x-axis. And if we click left or right, oops, if I turn my machine on. If I click right, I should move my x-axis to the right as shown. Clicking left moves it to the left as shown. If that's good, we tell it yes. The y-axis, this is the one that confuses a lot of people. The thing to remember with the y-axis is we are going to move our y-axis workpiece in relationship to the position of the spindle. So when we want to move up on the workpiece, by clicking the up arrow, we're going to move our workpiece this way. So we actually want to move it towards us when we click up. So when I click up and it moves this way, notice that's moving the tool up on the workpiece. Clicking down moves it down on the workpiece. We see quite often that gets reversed. It's an easy fix. We just go through this setup again. And then for our z-axis, we want to ensure that it moves up and down. It's hard to see in this camera angle, but that moves the z-axis up. That moves it down. We continue. Going back to our setup, our spindle settings, we want to make sure that we have that set to automatic. What that does is that allows the control board to turn that spindle off and on. So we save our preferences there. It's going to do a quick test of the spindle. We hear the spindle kick on. We can turn it back off. Everything is good there. We do not have homing switches on our machines at this time, so we want to disable that function. We also do not have a Z-probe at this time. These are things that we're looking at for future opportunities. We're just not there quite yet. Now that we are done, we're ready to start a project. I'm not going to run the test carve because I don't want to have to do the little Easel logo and my name. So I'm just going to say finish, and we're going to go to a basic Easel screen. And I'm just going to select a new project. Now, when you're at this screen, it will save many of your previous projects, things you've worked on. If you have a pro membership, as I do, it allows you to save a lot more of them. If you have a basic membership, it does limit you to the number that you can save. So keep in mind that it will start to drop some of the older ones off. So I'm just going to start a new project here. So when I start that, I've got my grid on my left-hand side and my preview on my right. The preview indicates the size of the piece of wood that I have. In this case, it's assuming that I'm approximately 300 millimeters by 200 millimeters by 12 millimeters thick. You don't have to absolutely put that measurement in there. It's a good idea to do so because that way you're seeing on the screen exactly what you have on the machine as well. It helps keep things in alignment. However, it's not an absolute requirement. The other thing that you don't always have to have in there is your thickness. The thickness defaults to 12.7 millimeters, or about half an inch. If you are just engraving into the surface of the wood, you're not trying to cut through something, you don't necessarily need to know what the thickness is because it doesn't really care, to be honest with you. So if I look at my workpiece real quick, we can see that I've got a piece of wood that's about 12 inches wide and probably about 4 or 5 inches tall. So I'm just going to work with that as I've got. It's a rough cut piece of wood, nothing real fancy there. If you want to change that, you simply click over here where it says birch plywood and gives you a measurement. If you click on that, it changes and allows you to change the material dimensions right here. I have it set to the metric system. Pretty much everything in the CNC world revolves around the metric system because it is more precise. I'm not going to get into tiling right now because that's more of a expert level type thing. We don't want to get too deep into it. The material type. This is something that is basically irrelevant when using a 3018. That material type selection will change the automatically calculated cut settings in Easel. We never want to use those because those are calculated for the X-Carve that uses a 1 horsepower router motor, something far more powerful than what we're working with here on this little machine. So on our material selection, the big thing you want to work with is your width and length. The next thing is our bit size. For our bit selection, this is where you have to enter in something relevant to the bit you are using. Now, in most cases, you're going to use this other function right here as an end mill in millimeters. Now, this 0.1 millimeters, that is for those little sharp point engraving bits, and I'll get a better shot of those here in just a moment. For those engraving bits, those are considered an end mill with a 0.1 millimeter cutting tip. In fact, let me switch over to that camera real quick so you can see those. That is these right here, these small little V-shaped bits that come with the machine standard. That is an end mill with a 0.1 millimeter cutting tip. You'll notice that the bit is fairly short, very stout, so it's not likely to break very quickly. If you're using some of our other bits, for example, if you've purchased our Essential Bit Kit, you'll have a set of these corn milling bits. They should all be labeled with the diameter. The diameter that we want to enter into Easel is that listed diameter, which is the cutting tip length, or diameter rather, the very end of it. These range from 0.8 millimeters up to 3.175. If you're using the flat nose or ball nose bits, Those are all a 3.175 diameter bit. They are a basic fluted bit. With the 3.175 millimeter, that's also equivalent to an eighth of an inch. We'll talk about bits in just a minute here when we get an actual project put in. So what I'm going to do is clear that. And the first thing I'm going to do is let's put just a basic shape on the screen. So I'm going to go up here and tell it I just want a star shape. So when I put this up, we see the basic outline of a star. We see on the right hand side that it's going to cut it out in a pocket. When we select that here, we see that it is going to a depth of 5 millimeters. Now if we tried to cut that 5 millimeters deep with that 0.1 millimeter bit, it's going to take a while. So what I'm going to do is reduce that down to about 0.4 millimeters. Now you can either use the slider or you can type in a value. And you'll notice that when I did that, it changed my preview over here, so you can see just barely now that that star is still outlined. If I don't want to clear out that pocket, I can select the option here, and I only want to cut out on the shaped path. So now it's only going to cut out the outline. What I'm going to do is increase that depth so you can see it on the preview a little bit better. It might still be kind of hard to see. So I'm going to run that back down. So with that, we've set our design, we've set our depth. Now notice when I put it on the grid, it just puts it smack in the middle, kind of offset to one side. If I wanted to make sure that this was in the exact middle of my board and this grid represented my board shape and size, then I could simply click on this and drag it wherever I needed to take it to. Just have to get to where I've got that little cross piece, and I can move it around. And that will move it to wherever it is on that piece of wood. One thing that I tend to do quite often is I will actually leave this down in the bottom left corner. That way I know that it's referenced as close as I can to where my bit is going to start at. And I'll show you that here in a little bit when we start doing the setup to start our carve. Once I've selected that, I want to make sure that I have my bit selection right. Now I've actually got one of our essential bit kit pieces in there, which is a 0.8 millimeter bit. So I'm going to set that in there. And you can see now that it slightly changed that preview, because now it's seeing that instead of cutting a little narrow path, it's cutting a path 8 times wider, so it needs to be able to go around that pathway. The settings that we talk about, the cut settings, that's where we have an issue with a lot of people that are having issues with broken bits. And that's because you're trying to move way too fast. And let me go back to that camera real quick. The cut settings listed in the manual. We start off with these bits right here. Like I said, this is a very stout bit. It's almost an eighth of an inch all the way down, or 3 millimeters. We recommend starting out with this bit at about 150 millimeters a minute with a depth per pass of about 0.2 to 0.4 millimeters. So not really that deep. It's going to make shallow cuts, and we're going to probably make a lot of them. So the thing to keep in mind is if you're using different bits, especially with the Essential Bit Kit, if I look at this 1 millimeter bit here, while I may have an 1/8 inch shank up here where it's actually being gripped in the machine, I've got this 10 millimeters of bit out here that's only 1 millimeter in diameter. It's going to be very, very fragile. So what we want to make sure we do is slow down our speed considerably. And what I've done is actually found that with this 0.8 millimeter bit that I have installed, running at a feed rate of approximately 50 millimeters a minute gives me a pretty decent cut. It's not real fast. It's not going to move at the speed of light by any stretch of the imagination. But it also doesn't put a lot of stress on the bit. If we go too deep or too fast with these smaller diameter bits, it will actually bend the bit while it's trying to carve, and that's what's going to snap a bit into. We've had some questions as well, the blue bits versus the titanium bits. Both the blue coating and the titanium coating are there to help dissipate heat, help prevent the heat from cutting, from damaging the bit itself. Now, with that, titanium is a little more resistant to heat, so if you were cutting into some harder woods, or even if you get into some of the softer metals, that's where you'd want to use that titanium bit as opposed to just the blue nano coated. So let me go back to Easel real quick here. So we've selected our 0.8 millimeter bit. The next thing we want to look at is our cut settings. This is where we always tell people we never ever want to use those automatic settings for our 3018. You're going to break things. So we always want to go into our manual mode. Now, as I noted, for our 0.8 millimeter bit, we want to run this clear down at around 50 millimeters a minute. We want to have our plunge rate no more than about 100. Now the plunge rate, that is as it's driving down into the wood, how fast is it moving? Since we're only going fractions of an inch, I'm not too worried about getting it too fast. Our depth per pass, I don't want to go more than about 0.2 to 0.3 millimeters. A good rule of thumb is you never want to go any deeper per pass than half the diameter of your bit. I'm taking that to an even more conservative level just because I don't want to damage anything. So once we have our cut settings, now we're actually ready to start our project. So what I'm going to do is show you how we go through that carve setup and get your initial position set. So to do this, we simply click the green carve button. And it's going to walk us through steps every time. We're going to do this with every cut. First thing it wants us to do is enter the thickness of our material. Again, if we're not trying to cut through it, this is not as critical a measurement. So I'm just going to leave it at the default. We want to make sure that it's secured. That's what we have our clamps for. We want to make sure this piece of wood isn't going to get jostled or moved once the bit starts moving. We want to confirm our bit. I know that we just installed that bit. That's the size we want to use. Now we set our work 0. This can be confusing for people. You'll remember that I placed my piece of art, that little star, down in the bottom left corner. So if I position my bit start point at the bottom left corner of my piece of wood, it's going to cut down in that corner. But I don't have to put it in that corner if I don't want to. I can put it anywhere on the piece of wood that I like. So what I'm going to do is switch over to the camera so you can see what it's doing. I apologize that we're looking straight down on it. I don't have another camera that shows it. But you can see that over here is the edge of my piece of wood. I'm basically right in the middle. I don't have to put this in that corner. If I want to make sure that I get my star right here in the middle of my piece of wood, I can simply do so by jogging my machine over to that position that I want. Now the key is when we get down to setting the 0 depth. Let me move this over just a little bit farther because I had a previous carve on there. When we set our height position, we want to get that bit to where it is just touching the piece of wood. So we want to make very small movements. And that's where we can change that interval on the easel screen to where we can move fractions of a millimeter at a time. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to use a piece of paper, and I've got it slid underneath my bit. And I want it to where I can just sit here and wiggle this back and forth. And as I lower my bit, I will get to a point where that piece of paper will start to drag. I can feel a little bit of resistance. So that tells me that my bit is right about at the piece of wood. Very close. It drags a little bit as I'm pulling it out. Once I've done that, that's where I want to start my position at. So I'm going to click that Use New Position button in Easel, which is the big blue one right there. Now we're pretty much ready to cut. This one should only take a couple of minutes, so I'm actually going to go ahead and let this run here shortly so you can see how it's moving. Like I said, this is at 50 millimeters a minute. So our steps are raise the bit. It's going to bring that bit up off the surface slightly. We're going to turn on the spindle, confirm that it's on, and I'm going to let it carve real quick so you can actually watch it moving. I'm going to try and move the camera so we can see what it's doing as we carve, so bear with me a moment here. So we can see that that is carving, but we're going very slowly so that we don't dislodge or put excess side load on that bit. Remember, with these fragile, smaller bits, this is something we're going to have to take into account. it's actually making a second pass around the outline because that outline may have been a little bit wider than our bit was. So if that outline was 1 millimeter, but our bit is only 0.8 millimeters, it needs to make that second pass to get the width that we've desired. So it made 2 rounds around that because, as I mentioned, if the line it was asking for was thicker than what the bit is, it needs to make that second pass in order to get the correct thickness of the line in there. Once it's done, it moves back to the position that we set our 0 at. I'm going to move the camera so hopefully nobody gets seasick here for a moment. But you can see where we got our design cut in there, and you'll notice that it's not exactly the same all the way across. Part of that is the piece of wood that I'm using. It has not been planed. It is not a solid piece of, or perfectly flat piece of wood. But you can also see where our bit ended up, right above where we zeroed it. It does not come back down to touch the surface of the wood. It stays just above it. So let me put my camera back up above the machine here. In Easel, it will ask you how things looked, if you're happy with it. If you say it looks great, it moves on. If you say not so great, it will say, okay, what can we do to fix it? I'm just going to use the default of, yeah, it looks great. We'll work with it. So that's a basic shape. Now, where a lot of people are also struggling is when we put something in there and their preview just doesn't look right. Usually when we get into that situation, it's because the bit selection is not correct. So to give you an example of that, I'm going to delete what I've got here, and I'm going to put in some text. And what I want to use is actually some of this very, very script fine text. Now once it's on there, you can double click on it and you can change it to whatever you need. So, well, since we're dealing with YoraHome here, I'm going to change it to obviously say YoraHome. Now you can see on the right hand side here, we've got it set to cut 5 millimeters deep. We don't quite need it that much. I'm not going to cut this at this time. But you can see where we can see pretty good definition in this text. Everything comes out fine. However, if our bit selection was still on our 1/8 inch default bit, you'll notice that our preview looks splotchy. We're just seeing bits and pieces of it in there. That's because Easel is smart enough to figure out that I can't get into that level of detail with a bit that diameter. So if you're trying to do something and it comes out with that splotchy look, you need to change the bit size to something that can accommodate it. You want to make sure that you select the proper bit, and you may want to select the largest bit you can find that will work for that. So if I go to my metric bits, and let's say I want to try a 2mm bit out of our essential bit kit. That gets me closer. It's still missing a couple of spots in there. You can see part of this, the flourish on the H is not coming in. That's because that line on the text is still just a little bit too narrow. So maybe I come down to my 1.6mm bit. That gets me pretty close, but I'm still missing a little bit of this fine line work here right around this O into the R. So I may have to go down to an even smaller bit. I'm going to take it down to the 1.2mm bit. Sometimes this takes that little bit of experimentation. So now we can see that on the preview, I'm getting all the detail I want. So I've gotten to the largest bit I can use to get the level of detail I want. That means I'm going to be using a little bit stronger bit. I might be able to go a little bit faster. With that 1.2mm bit, instead of going 50mm a minute, I might be able to get up to 75 or 80. The one thing that I didn't focus on as we were carving, when you're in the middle of a carve, right up here on the toolbar, right next to the carve button, you will see adjustments for speed. You can adjust your carving speed or your feed rate as the machine is working. So if you start to hear a chattering sound, or if you're starting to see chips of wood come out instead of a fine sawdust, that tells you that you're moving a little too fast and maybe you want to slow it down. If you're carving in a very fine, soft wood like pine or even some MDF types where it cuts very smoothly, you might be able to speed that up. That's part of the reason that we don't give firm numbers for every bit out there, because there are just far too many variables. Where I'm cutting this in pine, that 50mm a minute worked great for that 0.8mm bit. It might have been a little slow. I might have been able to speed it up just a hair. But in MDF, I might be able to almost double that. I don't know that for sure, and it's going to vary depending on the piece of wood, depending on the moisture content of the piece of wood. If I was doing this in oak, I would have to slow that down possibly even more, because oak is such a hard, dense wood that it's going to put additional stresses upon the bit, and we don't want to put that level of risk in there. Trying to think of what else we had in here. The types of bits. Let me go back to the camera there. Talk a little more about the bits themselves. Our engraving bits, the ones that come with the machine. You'll notice fine point. We mentioned that's a 0.1mm cutting tip. 1/10 of a millimeter is a very, very narrow cutting path. In order to cut a project like this YoraHome text, it would take a considerable amount of time. We personally made that mistake when we first got our 3018. We did a nice Celtic knotwork carving using this little engraving bit. It took approximately 64 hours to finish. It's when we realized we probably need to change our bits a little bit and change our design. Our end mills, these are designed for basic carving. They're not going to get you super fine detail unless you get down to the smaller bits. They will remove a fair amount of material. They're good general purpose milling bits. Like I said, you want to select the largest bit that you can use to get the level of detail that you want. Your flat nose and your ball nose bits. These are more for contouring and removing large quantities of material. The flat nose bit is going to cut out a 3 mm wide swath as it goes through the wood. You need to remove a large pocket of material. That's going to be the route you want to take. The ball nose bit is going to give you a smoother finish, however, because it's primarily cutting at just the very, very end of the bit where the ball nose is. See if I can get a good focus on that or not. Since it's a ball nose bit, its primary cutting is right there at the tip of that ball. So as it's spinning and cutting through the material, it will leave a smoother finish in there. Those are used a lot for contour or relief type carvings because they can do that slope a lot easier. I don't have our V-Carve bits down here for this machine right now. You'll find that V-Carve bits are very, very commonly used for a lot of fine detail. The thing to remember is with the V-Groove bits, A, in Easel, that does require use of the Easel Pro features. And B, the deeper you go with a V-Groove bit, the wider the carving is inherent in the shape of the bit. So, that's the basics of looking at the bits. I'll post up later on the settings that I did use for carving on these. Hopefully that helps you out a little bit. I don't know if there are any questions that have come in yet. Let me take a look if there's anything we need to cover. I'm not seeing anything as yet, but maybe Angie can tell us if we had any questions. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to switch back over to Angie real quick, and she can cover what we're going to talk about in the coming months, and we'll discuss any questions that came up while we were talking about everything. Give me just 1 second here. There you go.
Jim, there was a couple questions on the feed. I answered some of them, but maybe you can answer the other ones that I missed. As far as what's upcoming, one of our ambassadors next month, Mr. Joe Sweeney, is going to cover one of our 3D printers and how to set that up and how he uses slicing software to operate that. The following month after that is probably going to be one of my favorites. We have an ambassador that lives in the UK, and he is going to show us how he combines several of our machines to make custom guitars. So I really want to look forward to that. We also have some of the specialists that do graphics and light burn and laser gerbil. We're going to have photo tutorials. There's all sorts of exciting things coming up. So make sure you stay tuned to Creators Night each month. We're going to have a new ambassador. If you are interested in our ambassador program, please send me a message, Angie@YoraHome.com. I would be happy to talk with you if you have talents to share with the group. If you love our company and want the world to know it, we would love to have you on as an ambassador. There's great prizes and coupons that you can get as an ambassador. You can also get free publicity for your business, so we can help each other out. Jim, did you have those questions? Did you see the questions that we had from the customers?
No, I do not. Go ahead and hit me with a question, and we'll see if we can answer it.
Well, Christina wanted to know, she said her x-axis is backwards. She wanted you to cover how to fix that. And then there was a question about z-axis movement pausing. Wanted to know if that was a wiring issue or if there was something else going on.
Let's take those two first. For the x-axis, let me go back over here. for that x-axis being backwards, the easiest way to fix that is actually to go back through your machine setup. So if we go back to our machine setup real quick, we see our same thing. Now you have to go through these steps somewhat repetitively. So we go through our machine setup, we have to go through all these same steps again, select our current model that we want, our controller. Unfortunately, you got to do these steps every time, but I'm going to go through them real quick here. This is where it's going to be the easiest way to fix that x-axis. If we tell it, we want you to move left and right, but it's moving incorrectly, the easiest way to fix this is simply to tell it no. And what it's going to ask you is it moving but in the wrong direction, or is it not moving at all? In your case, it's moving in the wrong direction. So we click on that option, and it asks, do you want to just change that setting to reverse it? Well, yes, I do. So you can simply click that change the gerbil setting for the x-axis, and it will write that setting to the board for you, reversing your x-axis. So that should take care of that issue for you right there. Now, the other question about and then once you tell it to write those settings, you can test it again and see if it's working right. Now, the other question about it pausing during the middle of a carve. The most common cause for that is a network connection. Please keep in mind that Easel is a web-based program, so if you have any latency in your internet connection, it can cause problems with your carve. You always want to make sure that you have a stable connection. You also want to make sure that you have your computer set so that it doesn't go into screensaver mode, doesn't go into sleep mode. A lot of people have even gone to the step of making sure that it won't start trying to do any updates during the process automatically. Any of those things can cause interference. You may also, depending on your computer or your connection, make sure all of your other windows are closed, because other browser windows can cause a slowdown or a memory drain on your computer, which could interfere with the communication to the machine. If you keep having issues with that, there may be a problem with your control board, and we can take a look at that. If that's the case, send us an email to support@yorahome.com, and one of us will get in touch with you to see if we can't do some basic troubleshooting and check all the settings in your board a little bit deeper than what I want to get into on this, and we can make sure that everything's working properly. So that takes care of those two questions. Any others?
No, those were the only two questions that I was not able to answer. So that is all the comments that we have. Ambassador Burke says you're wearing his shirt.
No, I'm wearing mine. If I was wearing yours, you'd be naked, and that would be weird. So, all right. Well, now as Angie mentioned, we do have additional ambassador events coming up. We're going to shoot for the first week of every month. They may be at different times of the day depending on the schedule for the different ambassadors. So keep an eye on the Facebook group. We'll always announce them in there a day or two ahead of time. So with that, if you have any other questions, please feel free to send us an email. Hit us up on the group. We will try and answer. Remember that we can't watch that group 24 hours a day, so it may take us a little bit of time to get to that. And you can always email us at support@yorahome.com, and that will get one of our techs or someone else on the team in touch with you. So, everyone have a great evening, and we hope to hear from you soon.